The annual Wijk aan Zee tournament started today, and what a lineup. Of course, there's Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, but he is not going to have an easy time of it. There are several young pretenders to the crown, such as Fabiano Caruana, Wesley So, Anish Giri, Wei Yi, the young Chinese player. In fact, there are 3 Chinese players in the tournament. There's Ding Liren and the top women's player in the world, Ho Yifan. Well, it's going to be fascinating over the next couple of weeks. I've picked as my game of the day for round 1, Fabiano Caruana against Pavel Eljanov. Of course, Eljanov has had a fantastic autumn, played so well in the World Cup, so not an easy opponent. Let's see what happens. So Caruana with the white pieces, and it's a pretty classical start so far. Well, could go into a standard Queen's Gambit decline with Bishop e7 here. Bishop b4 is the ragazin. But Eljanov played the so-called Vienna variation, taking on c4, which of late has been very popular. And Caruana selected one of the sharpest lines. You can play Bishop g5. It's also very complicated, but rather over-analysed over the past few years. But instead, Caruana made this very interesting pawn sacrifice, allowing black to capture the pawn in the middle of the board and just castling. You can even take a second pawn if you want. I mean, that is extremely risky. Black is so far behind development. But maybe the most popular continuation here is just Bishop e7. And for the pawn, white has nice space and a big lead in development. Instead of that, Eljanov dropped the knight back to f6. So he's still a pawn up, but just declines to capture on c3. The advantage of this move is that the knight is able to protect black's kingside. So Caruana played bishop g5. He thought for a long time over that move. He admitted after the game that he suddenly hadn't expected this line, and it's been a long time since he'd analysed this particular continuation. So what has white got for his pawn? Well, it's obvious that he has a nice lead in development and some space, but black is very solid. There are no real weaknesses in this position. I mean, maybe you could look at this move h6 and say perhaps black is a little bit weaker on this diagonal. We'll see how that comes into play later on. But black's development is pretty straightforward. This knight swings round and allows black to occupy this nice square on d5. And of course, black would very much like to exchange pieces. I think this, for example, would be highly desirable for black. That gives the queen a square, perhaps allows the rook to come to d8, and that kind of eases the congestion in black's position. So, understandably, Caruana dropped the bishop back to g3. This position's actually been reached before in a blitz game between Mamedyarov and Kramnik, and Kramnik played f5. Now, I'm certainly not going to analyse a blitz game. Kramnik, very aware of the potential vulnerability of black along this diagonal, so just cuts this out straight away with f5. But of course, the downside to playing a move like f5 is that white has superb control over e5 now. So Eljanov, I think, played a better move, and that's bishop d7. Of course, this bishop needs to come out in order to connect the rooks. Caruana flung the knight over. So piece is still really active, but you can see black is so solid, and you know there are no real entry points into black's position. Bishop a4, now that's a very clever move from Eljanov. So he's attacking the rook. Now the obvious move is to play b3 here. Problem is that weakens the c3 square. Then the bishop would just come back to e8, but later on it might be significant that this square is a little bit weakened. So Caruana played rook c1. And then knight d7. That knight wasn't doing very much on b6, looks better on d7. And now this might be very confusing for you, but only now did Caruana play b3. Point is that in order to bring this bishop back, obviously it's not possible to play bishop c6 because of knight c6. Black has to trade on e5, and after pawn takes, this pawn does a very good job of protecting the f6 square and d6 as well. So the bishop comes back to c6. So that's a real spearhead for white's attack, and it means that the knight can't easily retreat to defend the king side. So now simply rook d1. So white's still a pawn down, but he has this big space advantage. And the problem for black is, although his pieces look very nicely placed, these are superb. Problem are his heavy pieces. You really need to bring the major pieces to the d file. That queen doesn't have a good square to develop to. It doesn't really want to sit on d7 because it's still on the same file as the rook, and tactically that's very suspicious. So how does black develop? In the meantime, you can see this pawn allows maybe the queen to travel out to g4 or h5, and this diagonal is well, white would very much like to set up a battery on that diagonal. So black has certain problems here. It's a much easier position for white to play than black. So a5 looks logical in order to try to open up a file for the rook, and understandably Caruana closed down that possibility straight away with a4 blocking. But now of course the b4 square is available for black's pieces. I think this is a crunch moment in the game actually. Black has to decide how he's going to bring these pieces into the game. One very interesting possibility is to play queen b8, and after queen g4 to bring the king's rook to d8. Now the point is that this potentially allows black's king to step to f8. In the game we'll see the king went into the corner, and that's potentially a little bit risky. Instead, Eljanov went to e8 in order to bring the rook to d8. Now, not a bad move. Caruana played h4, so he wants to try and put the pawn on h5 and make sure that this diagonal remains open. Another very interesting moment. Caruana pointed out this possibility after the game. Black could give back a pawn with h5. Really interesting. So what black wants to do is play g6 and king g7 and just set up a very solid pawn chain on the king side that would block this diagonal, for example. Of course, white can take that pawn, and now here's the point: f5. Clever idea. One sees this, actually, there's a particular variation of the King's Indian attack where you see exactly this tactic with a queen on e8 and a queen on h5. So white doesn't have time to take this pawn because black can take the queen, and after the queens are exchanged, of course, it's too late for white to capture en passant. So black gives back a pawn, but suddenly there's absolutely no attack against the king, and in some position like this, well, let's say king f7, black has the better chances here because these pieces are very well placed, and maybe you can counter-attack with rook h8. So yeah, h5, nice move. Instead, Eljanov played rook d8 and h5 from Caruana. Knight b4, well, still seems pretty reasonable for black. Knight looks good here, and black can trade pieces, but okay, you can trade rooks, but then what do? You could maybe play the queen over here and perhaps go for not rook c8, but rook d8, but you have to watch out for knight f6 check. While the queen is way across the other side of the board, you fling the knight in. Now, king h8 is possible here, but white still has a huge attack. But let me show you just what happens if this knight is taken. I mean, perhaps it's not surprising that white has a winning attack here. Queen f4, threatening mate with queen h6. After f5, you take, and here's a nice move. Rook d4. I mean, not very original, but still quite pretty. Threatening rook g4, and if that's taken, then of course that opens up the bishop's diagonal and allows queen h7 and mate. So Eljanov has to be careful here, and he played king h8. Well, the king commits itself to the corner. Let's see what happens. Knight f6 doesn't work here. Bishop f4, very, very nice move from Caruana. His idea is to put the bishop back on d2, eliminate this knight, and then, in a very brutal way, put his queen on this diagonal. At the moment, that knight covers these important squares, but if you whip off that knight and play queen c2, and suddenly this very crude mate is threatened. Here's a very interesting moment in the game. Eljanov is a very classical player. You know, he doesn't like to disturb his pawn structure if possible. But maybe this is the moment when he had to. He perhaps should have played queen f8 with the idea f6. Now, after white would exchange this off, then to some extent it wrecks black's kingside pawns. It's certainly not a beautiful thing to do, but it would open up the g-file for the rook, and one never knows, there's a potential hit down here. I mean, maybe Eljanov felt his position wasn't that desperate, so he declined to play like this. But it's certainly a decent counter-attacking idea. Instead, he continued to play classically and sensibly, trying to keep a decent pawn structure together. But after exchanging on b4 and taking on d5, suddenly things were not so clear. He now played pawn takes rook. If bishop takes, well, let's just show you Caruana's idea. Queen c2, very crude indeed. And, well, g6 would run into queen d2. There you go. Now that one's threatened. And after this one, well, knight f6 is pretty devastating move. White's attack is tremendous. And oh, here's another variation. This is very nice. If queen c6, wanting to exchange queens, then knight d6 is a wonderful move, threatening knight f7 mate, as well as queen h7 mate. And after queen c2, check on this diagonal. Black has to interpose with g6, and of course that's completely winning, followed by rook c7. Okay, back to the game. Pawn takes, but now white has this kind of overlap on the king side and can very often use that e6 pawn to further weaken the squares on this diagonal. By this time, both players were in time pressure, particularly Eljanov, and this is a highly unpleasant position to defend. That diagonal's still weak, so Eljanov closed it off, but you've got this lever, e6, to undermine the g6 pawn, and this is a horrible position for black now. Queen g4, great move, threatening the pawn, and after queen e7, queen d4, beautiful centralization. So this adds more power to this undermining move e6. And I mean, maybe black's best is simply to block, but then just queen takes b4. Eljanov tried b6. He wants to try and trade queens, but watch what happened. e6 check. That was blocked. Queen f4, hitting this one. Now, if king g7, then white just destroys the pawn front, and there is no defense to this, and the queen steps aside for knight f5, and it's over. g5 played, but watch the end of the game. Queen f5, threatening mate. Rook g7, and now queen c2, well spotted by Caruana. The bishop is loose, but also he makes way for the knight again. And the end was pretty horrible now. Knight f5. Well, rook g8 was played. If rook h7, I mean, it's a terrible move, but it's just for a bit of fun. e7, the bishop blocks, and black can barely move any of his pieces. He can just play a5 and steam that one home. In the game, rook g8 was played. And this lost instantly. Here, Eljanov resigned. If rook f8, then rook e6 hits 2 bishops, and that's too much. Beautiful game by Caruana, who, well, he admitted after the game he didn't like his position very much at all, but he made the best of it and managed to create enough chances to confuse Eljanov. So great win for him. Carlsen drew with Navarra. He was black. Very interesting game, quite short game, but there was some real cut and thrust there. Interesting draw. Weyi drew with Tomaszewski. Wesley So defeated Anish Giri. Giri played in a very uncharacteristically, positionally risky manner, and Wesley crushed him. Ho Ifan drew with Karyakin. Ding Liren defeated Adams, ground him down, and Mamedyarov drew with Van Veli. In round 2, we have Carlsen against Caruana. Should be good. Join me for that round tomorrow.